In the shadowed corridors of Renaissance Florence, where whispered conspiracies could topple governments and a single misspoken word could mean exile or death, Niccolò Machiavelli observed the delicate dance of power with the cold precision of a surgeon examining a patient's anatomy. His observations, born from years as a diplomat and political theorist, revealed a fundamental truth that echoes through the centuries: true power lies not in what one reveals, but in what one conceals. The young Lorenzo de' Medici once confided to his inner circle that his grandfather, Cosimo, had taught him the most valuable lesson of statecraft during a private dinner in their villa overlooking the Arno. "Grandson," the elder Medici had said, cutting into his meat with deliberate precision, "a ruler who shows all his cards will soon find himself with no game to play. The wise prince keeps 5 sacred secrets, for in these secrets lies the difference between ruling and being ruled." This wisdom, passed down through generations of successful leaders, forms the backbone of Machiavellian thought. The Prince, Machiavelli's masterwork, speaks openly of many strategies for gaining and maintaining power, but, buried within its pages and scattered throughout his other writings are hints at deeper truths, secrets that the most successful rulers have guarded jealously throughout history. The first secret concerns the true nature of loyalty. While Machiavelli wrote extensively about the importance of inspiring both love and fear, he understood that the most powerful leaders never reveal the full extent of their knowledge about those around them. A prince must appear to trust completely while secretly maintaining detailed intelligence on every ally, advisor, and potential rival. This creates what Machiavelli called the theater of confidence, a carefully constructed performance where subordinates believe they enjoy complete trust while the ruler maintains absolute awareness. Consider the case of Francesco Sforza, Duke of Milan, whom Machiavelli studied extensively. Sforza maintained power not through the traditional means of hereditary right, but through his masterful understanding of human nature and strategic concealment. He would regularly confide different versions of the same plans to different advisors, not out of confusion or indecision, but to test loyalty and identify potential sources of betrayal. When word of his secret plans reached his enemies, he could trace the leak with mathematical precision, eliminating threats before they fully materialized. The intelligence network that Sforza maintained was invisible to most observers. His servants, his guests, even his enemies' servants provided him with a constant stream of information. Yet he never appeared to be gathering intelligence actively. Instead, he cultivated an image of a straightforward military man who preferred action to intrigue. This calculated misdirection allowed him to operate with nearly perfect information while his enemies stumbled in darkness. The psychological impact of this approach cannot be overstated. When subordinates believe they are trusted completely, they reveal their true natures. They speak freely, plot openly among themselves, and gradually expose their genuine loyalties and ambitions. The ruler who appears trusting while remaining secretly vigilant gains access to the unguarded thoughts and plans of everyone in their sphere of influence. The second secret involves the careful management of one's own capabilities and resources. Machiavelli observed that rulers who displayed their full strength invited either submission born of fear or aggressive challenges from those who sought to prove themselves. The wise prince, therefore, reveals only enough strength to discourage casual opposition while keeping substantial reserves hidden from view. This principle extends beyond military might to encompass financial resources, political connections, and personal skills. The Duke of Ferrara, Ercole d'Este, exemplified this approach during his long and successful reign. He maintained several hidden sources of income that even his closest advisors knew nothing about. When crises arose, he could deploy resources that appeared to materialize from nowhere, creating an impression of almost supernatural capability. His enemies, never certain of his true strength, consistently overestimated his resources and chose diplomacy over direct confrontation. The psychological warfare implicit in this strategy operates on multiple levels. Enemies who cannot accurately assess their opponent's strength are forced to prepare for worst-case scenarios, draining their own resources and limiting their strategic options. Meanwhile, allies gain confidence from their association with a leader whose power seems inexhaustible, strengthening their loyalty and commitment. Perhaps more importantly, this approach prevents the emergence of precise coalitions against one's rule. Opposition requires accurate assessment of the target's weaknesses, but if key capabilities remain hidden, potential rebels cannot know whether their planned uprising has sufficient strength to succeed. This uncertainty alone prevents many challenges from ever materializing. The third secret concerns the deliberate cultivation of multiple, sometimes contradictory, public personas. Machiavelli understood that different audiences require different versions of leadership, and the successful prince must be capable of being all things to all people while remaining true to none except their core objectives. This is not mere duplicity, but rather a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Cesare Borgia, despite his eventual downfall, demonstrated this principle masterfully during his rise to power. To his soldiers, he was the brave commander who shared their dangers and celebrated their victories. To the church hierarchy, he was the dutiful son of the Pope, committed to expanding papal authority. To foreign diplomats, he was the reasonable negotiator seeking mutual benefit through careful treaties. To potential rivals, he was the ruthless warrior whose vengeance was swift and terrible. Each group saw a version of Borgia that aligned with their expectations and needs, creating multiple bases of support that seemed to contradict each other but actually reinforced his position. The maintenance of these multiple personas requires exceptional psychological discipline and strategic thinking. The ruler must never allow the different audiences to compare notes directly, must ensure that each group's version of his character serves their relationship with him, and must be prepared to shift between personas seamlessly as circumstances demand. This is far more complex than simple deception. It requires a deep understanding of human motivation and the ability to become, temporarily and convincingly, the leader that each situation requires. The fourth secret addresses the strategic use of information and the careful control of narrative. Machiavelli recognized that reality matters far less than perception in the realm of politics, and that the successful ruler must be the primary author of his own story while appearing to let others tell it for him. This involves the subtle manipulation of information flow, the strategic timing of revelations, and the cultivation of seemingly independent sources that actually serve the ruler's interests. The Medici family perfected this approach through their patronage of artists, writers, and scholars. They did not simply commission works that praised their rule directly, instead, they supported creators who naturally aligned with Medici values and perspectives. The resulting cultural output appeared independent and objective while actually reinforcing Medici legitimacy and vision. Historians and chroniclers, poets and painters all contributed to a narrative of Medici wisdom and benevolence that seemed to emerge organically from Florentine society rather than being imposed from above. This strategy extends to the management of both positive and negative information. The wise ruler ensures that good news reaches the people through multiple, seemingly independent channels, creating an impression of widespread prosperity and success. Conversely, negative information is controlled and channeled in ways that either minimize its impact or direct blame toward appropriate targets, often foreign enemies or internal saboteurs rather than the ruler's policies. The psychological sophistication of this approach lies in its respect for human intelligence. People resist obvious propaganda but readily accept information that appears to come from trusted, independent sources. By shaping the information environment rather than controlling it directly, the successful ruler guides public opinion while preserving the illusion of free discourse and independent thought. The fifth and, perhaps most crucial secret involves the deliberate cultivation of indispensability while appearing dispensable. This paradoxical approach requires the ruler to make himself absolutely necessary to the functioning of the state while publicly demonstrating humility and readiness to step aside for the greater good. The leader who successfully implements this strategy becomes impossible to remove without causing catastrophic disruption, yet appears so selfless that removal seems both ungrateful and unnecessary. Marcus Aurelius, though not a Renaissance prince, embodied this principle in ways that Machiavelli studied and admired. The emperor presented himself as a reluctant philosopher king, burdened by duty but committed to service. He regularly spoke of his desire to return to private life and philosophical contemplation, even as he systematically consolidated power and created institutional structures that made his continued leadership essential to Roman stability. His personal writings, later published as Meditations, reinforced this image of reluctant service and philosophical detachment, making any challenge to his authority appear not only treasonous but somehow crude and materialistic. The implementation of this strategy requires the leader to become genuinely indispensable through competence and institutional design while maintaining the public persona of someone who holds power reluctantly and would gladly surrender it to capable successors. This creates a psychological trap for potential opponents. To challenge such a leader appears selfish and destabilizing, since the leader himself appears to gain nothing from his position except burden and responsibility. These 5 secrets, the hidden intelligence network, concealed capabilities, multiple personas, narrative control, and cultivated indispensability form the foundation of what Machiavelli understood as sustainable power. Unlike the crude dominance of tyrants or the temporary authority of elected officials, this approach creates a form of leadership that appears natural, necessary, and beneficial to all parties involved. The young prince who masters these secrets does not rule through fear or love alone, but through a complex web of relationships and perceptions that makes his authority seem inevitable and his removal unthinkable. He becomes not merely a ruler, but an essential element of the social and political order itself. Part 2. The architecture of hidden influence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Palazzo Vecchio as Machiavelli prepared for another day of diplomatic correspondence. His desk, littered with reports from agents throughout Italy, told the story of a continent in constant flux, alliances forming and dissolving, armies marching and retreating, fortunes rising and falling with the regularity of tides. Yet beneath this apparent chaos, he had begun to discern patterns, structures of power that remained constant even as their outer manifestations shifted like shadows on a wall. The most successful rulers, he had observed, did not merely react to events but shaped them through networks of influence so subtle that even their beneficiaries rarely recognized their source. Pope Alexander VI, despite his moral failings, had demonstrated a masterful understanding of this principle during his papacy. The Borgia Pope did not simply issue commands or rely on the traditional authority of his office. Instead, he created a web of obligations, dependencies, and mutual interests that made resistance to his will appear not only futile but contrary to the self-interest of potential opponents. The architecture of this influence operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most visible level, Alexander dispensed the traditional rewards and punishments associated with papal authority, benefices for supporters, excommunication for enemies, dispensations for useful allies regardless of their moral standing. But, beneath this conventional exercise of power lay a more sophisticated system of control that extended far beyond the formal boundaries of church authority. Through careful placement of relatives and allies in key positions throughout Italy, Alexander created what modern observers might recognize as an early intelligence network. Cardinals in distant cities provided information about local political developments. Merchants with Borgia connections facilitated trade agreements that subtly favored allied cities while disadvantaging potential enemies. Even military commanders found their strategic options influenced by the availability of supplies, financing, and intelligence that flowed through channels controlled by the papal network. The genius of this system lay not in its secrecy. Many observers recognized that the Borgias were accumulating power beyond their official position, but in its apparent mutual benefit. Cities that aligned with papal interests found trade flowing more smoothly, disputes resolved more favorably, and military threats neutralized more efficiently. The benefits were real and substantial, creating genuine gratitude and dependency rather than mere submission to superior force. This principle of mutual benefit masquerading as coincidence became a cornerstone of Machiavellian strategy. The successful prince does not simply take what he wants through force or manipulation. Instead, he arranges circumstances so that others find their own interests naturally aligning with his objectives. This requires a deep understanding of human motivation and the patience to construct complex chains of cause and effect that appear entirely natural to their participants. The implementation of such strategies demands exceptional attention to timing and sequence. Consider the case of Ludovico Sforza's rise to power in Milan. Rather than attempting to seize control directly from his nephew, the legitimate heir, Sforza spent years positioning himself as the indispensable advisor and protector of the young duke. He gradually assumed responsibility for increasingly important state functions, always at the request or with the apparent consent of his nephew. By the time external threats required decisive leadership, the transfer of effective power to Sforza seemed not like a coup but like a natural response to circumstances. The psychological sophistication of this approach cannot be overstated. Sforza's nephew, along with the court and the people of Milan, participated in creating the very situation that legitimized Sforza's authority. They were not passive victims of manipulation but active participants in a process that served their immediate interests even as it advanced Sforza's long-term objectives. The young duke received protection and guidance during a dangerous period, the court maintained stability and access to power, and the people avoided the chaos of civil war or foreign invasion. This strategy of collaborative construction of authority requires the future ruler to suppress his immediate desires in favor of long-term positioning. Unlike the crude tyrant who seizes power through violence and maintains it through fear, the Machiavellian prince builds his authority so gradually and naturally that its culmination appears inevitable rather than ambitious. This patience in pursuit of power paradoxically makes that power more absolute when finally achieved, since it rests on genuine foundations rather than mere force. The management of information flows represents another crucial element in the architecture of hidden influence. The successful prince does not simply control information through censorship or propaganda, instead, he shapes the information environment so that accurate perceptions naturally align with his interests. This requires a sophisticated understanding of how human beings process and interpret information, particularly in social and political contexts. Francesco Guicciardini, Machiavelli's contemporary and sometime rival, exemplified this principle in his management of papal administration. As a high-ranking church official, Guicciardini had access to vast amounts of sensitive political and economic information. Rather than hoarding this information or using it for direct blackmail, he developed a reputation as a reliable source of accurate intelligence for rulers throughout Italy. This reputation made him indispensable to multiple political actors simultaneously, creating a network of obligations and dependencies that far exceeded his formal authority. The key to Guicciardini's success lay in his careful calibration of information sharing. He provided each recipient with accurate information that served their immediate needs while withholding details that might damage his long-term interests. More importantly, he never provided any single party with enough information to operate independently of his network. Each ruler received crucial intelligence, but always incomplete intelligence that required continued access to Guicciardini's services. This approach to information management creates what modern strategists might recognize as network effects. The value of connection to the network increases with the number of other participants, creating powerful incentives for continued cooperation. Rulers who attempted to exclude Guicciardini from their councils found themselves operating with incomplete information in a competitive environment where their rivals enjoyed superior intelligence. The natural result was a gravitation back toward cooperation with the network, reinforcing its power and influence. The cultivation of strategic dependencies extends beyond information to encompass economic, military, and cultural relationships. The Medici banking network provides perhaps the most sophisticated historical example of this approach to power construction. Rather than simply accumulating wealth for its own sake, the Medici family used their financial resources to create a web of economic relationships that made their continued prosperity essential to the stability of trade throughout Europe. Medici banks in London, Bruges, Naples, and other major commercial centers did not merely facilitate trade, they actively shaped the structure of international commerce through their lending practices, currency operations, and trade financing. Merchants throughout Europe found their business operations subtly guided by the availability and terms of Medici financial services. Rulers discovered that their military and political ambitions could be advanced or hindered by their access to Medici credit and banking expertise. The psychological impact of this economic influence operated on multiple levels. Individual merchants and rulers experienced the Medici network as a source of opportunity and prosperity rather than control or domination. The benefits of cooperation were immediate and tangible, while the costs of resistance were often delayed and difficult to attribute directly to Medici policy. This asymmetry in the timing of rewards and punishments made cooperation appear rational and beneficial while resistance seemed self-destructive and irrational. Moreover, the complexity of the Medici economic network made it difficult for potential opponents to understand, much less counter, the sources of Medici influence. A ruler who attempted to exclude Medici banks from his territories might find trade routes shifting, credit becoming more expensive, and commercial relationships deteriorating through what appeared to be natural market forces rather than deliberate policy. The invisibility of the causal mechanisms protecting Medici interests made resistance both difficult to organize and dangerous to attempt. The cultural dimension of hidden influence represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Machiavellian strategy. Unlike economic or military power, which operates through clearly visible mechanisms, cultural influence shapes the fundamental assumptions and values that guide human behavior. The successful prince does not merely control what people do, he influences what they think and feel, creating a form of authority that appears to emerge from the natural order rather than political construction. The Renaissance papacy, despite its numerous moral and political failures, demonstrated exceptional sophistication in the exercise of cultural influence. Through patronage of art, architecture, music, and literature, successive popes shaped European culture in ways that reinforced papal authority while appearing to serve universal human values. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, Bramante's architectural designs for St. Peter's Basilica, and countless other artistic achievements created a cultural narrative of papal grandeur and divine authority that transcended immediate political circumstances. The psychological power of this cultural influence lay in its apparent independence from political manipulation. Visitors to Rome experienced genuine awe and inspiration in the presence of great art and architecture, emotions that naturally transferred to the institution that had made such achievements possible. The papacy benefited from this emotional response without appearing to have manufactured it artificially, since the artistic works possessed genuine aesthetic and spiritual value independent of their political function. This principle of leveraging authentic value for political purposes became a hallmark of successful Machiavellian strategy. The most effective forms of cultural influence provide real benefits to their audiences: beauty, inspiration, knowledge, entertainment, while simultaneously advancing the political objectives of their sponsors. This dual function makes such influence both more powerful and more sustainable than crude propaganda, since it serves genuine human needs while shaping political perceptions. The integration of these various forms of hidden influence, intelligence networks, mutual benefit systems, information management, strategic dependencies, and cultural authority creates what Machiavelli recognized as the deepest form of political power. Unlike the authority of kings or the dominance of conquerors, this integrated influence operates through the voluntary cooperation of its subjects. People submit to such power not because they must, but because they want to, because resistance would damage their own interests and cooperation brings genuine benefits. The construction of such comprehensive influence requires extraordinary patience, intelligence, and strategic vision. The future prince must be willing to forego immediate gratification in favor of long-term positioning, must understand human psychology with scientific precision, and must possess the disciplinary control necessary to maintain multiple complex strategies simultaneously over extended periods. Few individuals in history have demonstrated all of these qualities, which explains why genuine Machiavellian power remains rare despite the apparent simplicity of its principles. Yet for those capable of implementing these strategies, the rewards extend far beyond mere political success. The prince who builds power through hidden influence creates a form of authority that enhances rather than diminishes human flourishing. His subjects prosper through their cooperation with his designs, his enemies find resistance costly and unrewarding, and society as a whole benefits from the stability and progress that flow from effective leadership. This alignment of personal ambition with general welfare represents the highest achievement of political art, the goal toward which all Machiavellian strategy ultimately aims. Part 3, The Eternal Game and its modern applications. The afternoon light filtering through the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria cast geometric patterns across Machiavelli's final manuscript pages as he contemplated the eternal nature of political competition. Time had taught him that while the external forms of power might evolve, kingdoms giving way to republics, feudalism yielding to mercantile states, the fundamental dynamics of human ambition and social organization remained constant across centuries. The prince who mastered these timeless principles could adapt to any political environment, while those who relied solely on temporary advantages would inevitably find their power eroding with changing circumstances. The great irony of Machiavellian strategy lay in its simultaneous dependence on secrecy and its ultimate revelation through success. The prince who perfectly implemented the 5 secrets would eventually become so powerful, so indispensable, and so beneficial to society that others would naturally seek to understand and emulate his methods. This created what Machiavelli recognized as the dialectical nature of political wisdom. Its effectiveness guaranteed its eventual exposure, yet its exposure did not necessarily diminish its power. Consider the case of Venice, whose republican institutions embodied Machiavellian principles so thoroughly that their methods became widely studied and imitated throughout Europe. The Venetian system of governance incorporated all 5 secrets in institutional form. The Council of Ten maintained extensive intelligence networks throughout the Mediterranean world, gathering information through merchants, diplomats, and spies while presenting itself as merely concerned with trade and security. The true extent of Venetian military and economic capabilities remained hidden behind the facade of a peaceful commercial republic, yet their fleets could appear suddenly, in distant waters when circumstances required decisive action. The Venetian state projected different personas to different audiences with systematic precision. To fellow Christian powers, Venice appeared as a bulwark against Ottoman expansion, deserving of support and cooperation. To Muslim rulers, Venetian merchants presented themselves as pragmatic traders interested only in mutual profit, avoiding the religious antagonisms that complicated relations with other European powers. To potential rivals within Italy, Venice maintained the image of a peaceful republic focused on commerce rather than territorial expansion, even as it systematically absorbed neighboring territories through economic pressure and strategic alliances. The Venetian approach to narrative control operated through what modern observers would recognize as soft power projection. Rather than proclaiming their success directly, Venetian leaders encouraged foreign observers to marvel at their prosperity, stability, and wise governance. Chronicles and diplomatic reports from throughout Europe praised Venetian institutions and methods, creating a reputation for competence and success that made other rulers eager to maintain good relations with the Republic. Most importantly, Venice made itself indispensable to the broader European political system through its unique capabilities in trade, finance, and information. No other state possessed the combination of geographic position, commercial networks, and institutional sophistication that Venice provided to international commerce and diplomacy. Attempts to exclude Venice from European affairs consistently failed because such exclusion damaged the interests of all other participants more than it harmed Venice itself. The Venetian example demonstrated that Machiavellian principles could be embedded in institutional structures that outlasted individual rulers. Rather than depending on the genius of a single prince, the Venetian system created a framework that guided successive generations of leaders in the application of sophisticated power strategies. This institutional embodiment of Machiavellian wisdom represents perhaps the highest achievement of political art, since it makes effective governance sustainable across time while adapting to changing circumstances. The evolution of these principles in the modern era reveals both their enduring relevance and their increasing sophistication. Contemporary organizations, whether political, commercial, or social, that achieve lasting success typically employ variations of the 5 Machiavellian secrets, though often without conscious recognition of their historical precedents. The mechanisms have become more complex and the scales larger, but the fundamental dynamics of human motivation and social organization remain unchanged. Modern intelligence gathering, for instance, far exceeds anything available to Renaissance princes in scope and sophistication, yet it serves the same basic function of providing decision-makers with superior information about the intentions and capabilities of allies and rivals. Contemporary leaders who fail to maintain effective intelligence operations find themselves repeatedly surprised by developments that more sophisticated competitors anticipated and prepared for well in advance. The principle of concealing capabilities has likewise evolved to accommodate modern contexts while retaining its essential character. Successful contemporary organizations, whether nations or corporations, typically maintain strategic reserves and hidden capabilities that they reveal only when circumstances require decisive action. The element of surprise remains as crucial to competitive success today as it was in Machiavelli's time, perhaps more so given the speed at which modern competition unfolds. The cultivation of multiple personas has become even more important in an era of global communications and diverse stakeholder groups. Successful modern leaders must simultaneously appeal to domestic and international audiences, commercial and political constituencies, traditional supporters, and emerging demographics. This requires the same psychological sophistication that Machiavelli observed in successful Renaissance princes, adapted to the complexity of contemporary social and economic relationships. Information management and narrative control have evolved into entire industries dedicated to shaping public perception and opinion. Modern leaders who ignore these dimensions of power competition do so at their peril, since their rivals will certainly attempt to control the information environment to their own advantage. The proliferation of communication channels has made narrative control more complex but also more crucial, since stories spread faster and further than ever before while becoming increasingly difficult to correct once established. The principle of cultivated indispensability has perhaps undergone the most sophisticated development in modern contexts. Contemporary successful leaders, whether in politics or business, typically make themselves essential to complex systems that would suffer significant disruption from their removal. This involves not merely personal competence but the construction of organizational structures, relationships, and dependencies that make continuity of leadership appear necessary for stability and prosperity. The application of these principles in contemporary democratic contexts requires particular sophistication, since the mechanisms of accountability and transparency that characterize modern governance make crude manipulation obvious and counterproductive. The successful democratic leader must achieve Machiavellian objectives through methods that appear entirely consistent with democratic values and procedures. This represents perhaps the highest form of political art, since it requires achieving lasting power through means that enhance rather than undermine the consent of the governed. The business applications of Machiavellian strategy have become increasingly apparent as commercial competition has intensified and global markets have emerged. Successful modern corporations typically employ all 5 secrets, though adapted to commercial rather than political contexts. They maintain extensive market intelligence operations, conceal their true capabilities from competitors, project different images to different market segments, control their public narratives through sophisticated marketing and public relations efforts, and make themselves indispensable to their customers, suppliers, and business partners. The technology sector provides numerous examples of modern Machiavellian strategy in action. Leading technology companies gather vast amounts of data about their users, competitors, and market conditions while revealing little about their own internal operations and strategic planning. They maintain hidden research and development capabilities that allow them to surprise markets with revolutionary products and services. They present different aspects of their operations to different audiences, emphasizing innovation to investors, privacy to consumers, cooperation to regulators, and competitive advantage to business partners. These companies control their public narratives through sophisticated media strategies that make their success appear inevitable and beneficial while minimizing attention to potential negative consequences of their operations. Most importantly, they make themselves indispensable to modern life by providing services that become integral to business operations, social relationships, and personal productivity. The thought of losing access to these services creates powerful psychological resistance to any policies or competitors that might threaten the company's continued dominance. The international relations applications of Machiavellian strategy have evolved to accommodate the complexity of modern global governance while retaining their essential character. Successful contemporary nations maintain extensive intelligence operations, conceal the full extent of their military and economic capabilities, project different images to different international audiences, shape global narratives through sophisticated information operations, and make themselves indispensable to international systems of trade, security, and cooperation. The rise of China as a global power provides perhaps the most comprehensive contemporary example of Machiavellian strategy in international relations. Chinese leaders have consistently understated their capabilities and ambitions while building comprehensive national power across military, economic, technological, and cultural dimensions. They present different aspects of Chinese development to different international audiences, emphasizing peaceful development to neighbors, economic opportunity to trading partners, and cultural heritage to global audiences interested in Chinese civilization. China has systematically made itself indispensable to the global economy through manufacturing capabilities, market access, and infrastructure development while maintaining the facade of a developing country deserving of special consideration and support. The Belt and Road Initiative exemplifies this approach by creating economic dependencies that appear to benefit all participants while advancing Chinese strategic objectives throughout Asia, Africa, and Europe. The psychological dimensions of modern Machiavellian strategy have become increasingly sophisticated as understanding of human behavior has advanced through scientific research. Contemporary practitioners can draw upon insights from psychology, neuroscience, behavioral economics, and social science to design influence strategies that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness while respecting ethical boundaries appropriate to their contexts. The principle of reciprocity, for instance, has been refined through experimental research into a precise understanding of how obligations and dependencies can be created through carefully calibrated exchanges of benefits. Modern leaders who understand these principles can create networks of mutual obligation that operate through voluntary cooperation rather than coercion while achieving the same strategic objectives that Renaissance princes pursued through cruder methods. The importance of emotional rather than purely rational appeals has likewise been validated and refined through contemporary research. Modern Machiavellian strategy recognizes that human decision-making involves emotional and social factors as much as logical analysis, and successful influence operations must address these non-rational elements of human psychology to achieve lasting effect. The sustainability of Machiavellian power in contemporary contexts depends largely on its alignment with genuine value creation and social benefit. Unlike historical periods where raw force could maintain authority indefinitely, modern societies possess mechanisms for detecting and resisting purely exploitative power relationships. Contemporary Machiavellian strategy must therefore create real value for all participants while advancing the strategic objectives of its practitioners. This requirement for mutual benefit rather than exploitation represents both a constraint and an opportunity for modern practitioners of Machiavellian strategy. The constraint lies in the necessity of designing influence operations that genuinely serve the interests of their targets rather than merely appearing to do so. The opportunity lies in the sustainability and self-reinforcement of power relationships based on mutual benefit, which tend to strengthen over time rather than requiring constant maintenance through force or deception. The ethical implications of modern Machiavellian strategy deserve careful consideration, particularly in democratic contexts where the legitimacy of authority depends on the informed consent of the governed. The line between legitimate influence and manipulative deception can become blurred when sophisticated psychological techniques are employed to shape behavior and opinion. Contemporary practitioners must therefore develop ethical frameworks that preserve the autonomy and dignity of those subject to their influence while achieving necessary strategic objectives. The resolution of this ethical tension typically involves ensuring that influence operations enhance rather than diminish the welfare and capabilities of their targets. Machiavellian strategies that make people more prosperous, more secure, more capable, and more satisfied with their circumstances can claim ethical justification even when they also advance the interests of their designers. This alignment of strategic effectiveness with ethical responsibility represents the highest achievement of modern political art. The future evolution of Machiavellian strategy will likely involve increasing sophistication in the integration of technological capabilities with traditional principles of human influence. Artificial intelligence, data analytics, global communications networks, and other emerging technologies provide unprecedented opportunities for gathering information, concealing capabilities, managing multiple personas, controlling narratives, and creating indispensable value. Yet these same technologies also create new vulnerabilities and opportunities for rivals who understand how to exploit them. The prince who masters both the timeless principles of Machiavellian strategy and the contemporary tools for their implementation will possess advantages over competitors that exceed anything available to historical rulers. Yet this same technological evolution ensures that such advantages will be temporary unless continuously renewed through innovation and adaptation. The eternal game of power competition thus continues with higher stakes and faster movement while retaining its fundamental character as a contest between human intelligence, will, and strategic vision. The ultimate lesson of Machiavellian strategy, whether applied in Renaissance Italy or contemporary global competition, lies not in the specific techniques of power acquisition and maintenance but in the deeper understanding of human nature and social organization that underlies these techniques. The prince who truly comprehends why these methods work can adapt them to any context and any era, while the mere imitator of surface techniques will find his strategies becoming obsolete as circumstances change. The 5 secrets: hidden intelligence, concealed capabilities, multiple personas, narrative control, and cultivated indispensability represent not arbitrary tricks of political manipulation but fundamental principles derived from the deepest patterns of human social behavior. They work not because they exploit human weaknesses but because they align with human strengths and motivations in ways that create sustainable relationships of mutual benefit and voluntary cooperation. This understanding transforms Machiavellian strategy from a cynical tool of domination into an instrument of social progress and human flourishing. The prince who employs these methods to enhance the prosperity, security, and capabilities of his subjects serves not only his own ambitions but the broader cause of civilization itself. In this alignment of personal success with public benefit lies the true genius of Machiavellian thought and its enduring relevance to the challenges of leadership in any age. The shadows lengthened across Florence as Machiavelli set down his pen for the final time, knowing that he had captured truths about power and human nature that would resonate through the centuries. The specific forms of political competition would evolve, the technologies of influence would advance, and the scales of strategic thinking would expand, but the fundamental dynamics of leadership and authority would remain constant. Future princes who understood these principles would prosper, while those who ignored them would find themselves swept aside by the relentless currents of historical change. The eternal game continues, played by new participants with new tools but governed by the same immutable laws that Machiavelli first discerned in the turbulent politics of Renaissance Italy. The secrets remain secret not because they are hidden but because they require wisdom to understand and discipline to implement. In their proper application lies the key to lasting power and the foundation of enduring achievement in the endless competition for influence and authority that defines human society itself.